Welcome, my friends, to an evening of icy dread. Winter's chill has a way of creeping not only into our bones, but into our very souls. Tonight I invite you to warm yourself by the fire as we journey through 3 tales of terror, stories of isolation, madness, and unspeakable horrors lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. But beware. Not all who gather to hear them will leave unscathed. Prepare yourself, for these winter nights are long, and the darkness hungers. The frost-laden wind howled through the trees, a spectral symphony that encased the small house on the hill in an embrace of icy solitude. Inside, nestled within the sturdy wooden walls, was Margaret, a solitary figure at the hearth of her sanctuary. The blizzard outside was a relentless force, swirling snow into ghostly spirals that danced beneath the pale gaze of the moon. She drew her shawl closer as she sipped a steaming cup of tea, the warmth rising like ethereal smoke into the dimly lit room. Her evening had started as a reprieve from the week's mundane labors. A plate of sugared biscuits sat on the coffee table, their sweetness a counterpoint to the bitterness of the storm. On the television screen, a horror film flickered, a grotesque tale of a murderer who preyed upon women in lonely homes. The killer, an imposing figure with a shadowy visage and a penchant for taunting his victims before the kill, had an unsettling habit of knocking on doors to lure his prey into a false sense of security. The film depicted chilling reenactments of the women's final moments, the creak of footsteps, the flicker of lights, and the horrifying crescendo of screams that faded into silence. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the channel, unable to bear the grotesque imagery any longer. The hollow laughter of a sitcom now filled the room, a jarring contrast to the sinister ambiance clawing at her nerves. It was then that she heard it, a knock at the door, a sharp, singular rap that echoed through the house. Her breath caught, and her heart began a staccato rhythm. Rising cautiously, she approached the door, the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet loud against the silence. She peered through the peephole but saw nothing, only the whirling snow and the skeletal branches of trees bowing under the storm's fury. "Hello?" she called, her voice brittle. No response. Margaret's hand hesitated on the lock, her fingers cold against the metal. After a moment, she secured the deadbolt and retreated to the living room, her tea forgotten, and her appetite vanished. Her nerves pricked like needles as she checked each window, ensuring they were locked. The house seemed to shrink under the weight of her unease, its shadows lengthening as the hours dragged on. Seeking solace in routine, she ascended the stairs to her bedroom, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She double-checked the lock on her bedroom door before curling into bed, the covers pulled tightly around her. The storm's wails grew louder, and she tried to lose herself in a book, but the words blurred together, meaningless against the tide of her mounting dread. Another knock, this one softer, more deliberate, reverberated through the house. Margaret froze, her blood turning to ice. It wasn't at the front door this time. No, this sound came from below, from the basement. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached for the phone. Her trembling fingers fumbled to dial the sheriff's office. When the dispatcher answered, Margaret's voice quivered as she explained her situation. The response was less comforting than she had hoped. "The storm's got the roads near impassable, ma'am. It'll be a couple of hours before we can get out there. Keep your doors locked and stay safe." Margaret hung up, the receiver slipping from her grasp. She bolted to the bedroom door, sliding a chair under the knob for reinforcement. Her pulse roared in her ears as she pressed herself against the headboard, her eyes fixed on the door. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Then it came. A knock at the bedroom door. Her heart stopped, and her breath hitched painfully in her throat. The knock was gentle at first, almost polite, but as the moments passed, it grew louder, more insistent. The door rattled in its frame, the wood groaning under the assault. Margaret clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face as she silently prayed for the nightmare to end. Suddenly, the knocking ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that swallowed every other sound. Margaret remained frozen, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the door. Hours passed, or perhaps mere minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The sheriff's arrival was heralded by the crunch of tires on snow. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows through the windows as two deputies approached the house. Margaret opened the door with trembling hands, her face pale and drawn. She recounted her harrowing ordeal as the deputies investigated. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice heavy with unease, "you might want to see this." She followed them to the front door, where a trail of footprints led from the porch into the woods. The prints were deep and distinct, but they ended abruptly at the edge of the tree line, as though the intruder had simply vanished into thin air. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. Margaret stood there, staring at the hauntingly incomplete trail. The storm had calmed, the snow falling gently now, but the chill that gripped her was not from the winter air. It was the cold hand of terror, a lingering presence that whispered she was not alone. The asylum rose before them like a monolith of despair, shrouded in snow and shadow. Ridgefield Asylum had been abandoned for decades, its history so dark that even time seemed to avoid it. Stories whispered through the years spoke of the heinous experiments conducted within its walls, inhuman surgeries and treatments at the hands of Dr. Alexander Greaves, a physician whose name had become synonymous with cruelty. His victims were said to wander the halls still, grotesque and broken, eternally trapped in the nightmare he had wrought. Evelyn stood at the rusted gates, her flashlight cutting a narrow path through the swirling snow. Beside her, Mark adjusted his camera, its lens fogged by the bitter cold. Harriet, the group's historian, clutched her journal, while Liam, the youngest and most eager, shuffled nervously at the rear. "It looks even worse than I imagined," Harriet murmured, her breath clouding the icy air. Evelyn tightened her scarf and pushed forward. "We came to uncover the truth. Let's not lose our nerve now." The gates creaked open, groaning like a dying beast. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they crossed the threshold, the asylum's looming facade swallowing them whole. Once inside, the air turned stifling, heavy with decay and something else, something foul and unnatural. Their flashlights swept over shattered windows, broken furniture, and walls scrawled with graffiti. But beneath the vandalism, faint outlines of faded symbols and words in an unfamiliar language peeked through, as if the asylum itself had tried to communicate its anguish. The group advanced cautiously through the main corridor. The floor was littered with debris, papers, shattered glass, and the occasional rusted surgical instrument. Doors hung off their hinges, revealing glimpses of darkened rooms that seemed to breathe with malevolent energy. "It feels alive," Liam whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's just your imagination," Mark said, though his grip on the camera tightened. But even Mark couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere. The walls seemed to pulse, and the air grew colder with every step. The group paused in what had once been the common area, a cavernous room filled with overturned chairs and shattered glass. A broken clock on the wall read 3:15, its hands frozen in time. The sound of faint whispers began to drift through the air, too soft to be understood but impossible to ignore. "Do you hear that?" Harriet asked, her eyes darting around the room. Evelyn nodded, her flashlight trembling slightly. The whispers grew louder, shifting into anguished cries that seemed to emanate from all around them. Liam gasped, his light catching a shadow that moved just beyond their sight. "What was that?" he stammered, stepping closer to Evelyn. The first vision came swiftly and without warning. Harriet froze, her flashlight dropping to the ground as her eyes widened in horror. Before her stood a patient in a hospital gown, their skin gray and mottled, their eyes black pits of despair. The figure's head twitched unnaturally as it opened its mouth, revealing teeth filed to jagged points. "Help me," it rasped, its voice a guttural croak. "Help me." The others turned, but by the time they saw Harriet's terror, the figure was gone. Harriet fell to her knees, clutching her chest as if her heart might burst. "What did you see?" Evelyn demanded, helping her to her feet. "Someone, something. It wasn't human," Harriet whispered, her voice quivering. Mark scoffed, though unease flickered in his eyes. "This place is messing with your head." But no one missed how Mark kept glancing over his shoulder as they moved deeper into the asylum. The operating theater loomed ahead, its doors hanging open like a yawning mouth. The group entered reluctantly, their flashlights illuminating a scene of horror. The operating table in the center was stained dark, its straps hanging limp. Instruments lay scattered across the floor, scalpels, saws, and devices whose purposes were too grotesque to imagine. "It's colder in here," Harriet muttered. Her breath rose in pale clouds. The lights of their flashlights began to flicker, and a low hum filled the room. It was a sound that crawled beneath their skin, setting their teeth on edge. Then the lights went out entirely. Panic erupted in the dark. Mark cursed, fumbling with his camera. Evelyn called out for calm, but her voice was drowned by the rising cacophony of whispers and cries. When the lights flickered back on, Liam was gone. "Liam!" Evelyn shouted, but only silence answered. They searched the room frantically, their flashlights revealing nothing but the empty shadows. Then they heard it, a wet, sickening sound from the corridor. They rushed out, their lights catching a trail of crimson that led into the darkness. At its end, Liam's body lay crumpled, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide with terror. Harriet screamed, and Mark retched, doubling over. Evelyn forced herself to remain steady, though her hands shook as she pulled Harriet to her feet. "We have to keep moving," she said. "If we stay here, we'll die." But the asylum wasn't finished with them. As they moved deeper into the labyrinthine halls, the attacks became more frequent. Figures in hospital gowns emerged from the shadows, grotesque patients with bloated faces and limbs that bent in impossible ways. They clawed and grabbed at the group, their voices a haunting chorus of pain and rage. Mark was the next to fall. He lingered too long in the rear, his camera catching fleeting glimpses of the figures before they overwhelmed him. The last thing Evelyn and Harriet heard was his scream as he was dragged into the darkness, his flashlight spinning wildly before going dark. Harriet sobbed uncontrollably now, clutching Evelyn's arm as they stumbled forward. The walls seemed to close in, their surfaces pulsating with veins of some foul substance. The whispers grew deafening, the cries now screams that reverberated through their bones. Finally, they reached what they thought was an exit, only to find themselves back in the operating theater. Harriet broke down, sinking to the floor as Evelyn frantically searched for another way out. But there was no escape. A shadow fell over Harriet, and she looked up to see Dr. Greaves himself standing over her. His face was pale and thin, his eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. "Ah, another subject," he purred. Harriet's scream was cut short as he plunged a rusted scalpel into her chest. Evelyn ran, the echoes of Harriet's cries propelling her forward. But the asylum had claimed her too. She tripped, her head striking the cold floor. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the doctor's face, smiling down at her. When Evelyn awoke, she was strapped to the operating table. The light above her was blinding, and the instruments gleamed in Dr. Greaves's hands. "Now, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and venomous, "let's see what makes you scream." And scream she did, her voice echoing through the forsaken asylum as the winter storm howled outside. The snowstorm raged with a ferocity that seemed almost alive, its icy tendrils enveloping the remote cabin in a suffocating grip. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of pine, smoke, and the sharp tang of marijuana. 5 friends gathered in the living room, their laughter mingling with the occasional clink of glasses as they celebrated the dawn of a new year. The cabin, with its rustic charm and isolation, had seemed the perfect getaway until the storm hit, trapping them in its wintry snare. "This storm is insane," muttered Jake, peering out the frosted window. His breath fogged the glass as he squinted into the swirling white abyss. "No way we're getting out of here tonight." "Good thing we've got plenty of booze and weed," said Sam, raising a bottle of whiskey in mock salute. The others laughed, their spirits buoyed by the intoxicants and the illusion of safety. The group settled into an easy rhythm, sharing ghost stories and urban legends as the hours ticked by. The dim glow of the lanterns cast flickering shadows on the walls, turning the room into a tableau of shifting shapes. Outside, the wind howled like a beast, rattling the windows and sending chills through the thick logs of the cabin. It was during one of these stories, as Lila recounted a tale of a haunted asylum, that the lights suddenly went out. The room plunged into darkness, the laughter and chatter silenced in an instant. The wind's roar filled the void, its voice like a mournful wail. "Great," said Jake, his voice cutting through the dark. "Power's out." "I'll grab a flashlight," offered Tara, fumbling for her phone to light her way. Moments later, the power flickered back on, casting an eerie brightness over the room. But something was wrong. "Hey," said Ryan, glancing out the window. "Where's the van?" The group crowded around the glass, their breath fogging the panes. The space where their van had been parked was now an empty expanse of snow. Tracks led away into the storm, disappearing into the swirling white. "Who the hell would take our van?" demanded Jake, his voice rising with a mix of anger and fear. "We're in the middle of nowhere." No one had an answer. The atmosphere, once jovial, was now heavy with unease. They locked the doors and windows, barricading themselves against the unseen threat outside. And then the lights went out again. This time, the darkness felt suffocating, as though the cabin itself were closing in. A scream pierced the void, a guttural primal sound that froze the blood of everyone who heard it. When the lights flickered back on, Lila was slumped in her chair, her throat slashed in a grotesque grin of crimson. The others stared, their faces masks of shock and horror. "Jesus Christ!" Sam shouted, his voice cracking. "Who did this?" "It wasn't me," Jake said, backing away from the group. "I didn't do anything." "None of us did," Tara snapped, her eyes darting between her friends. "There's someone else here. There has to be." But the seed of distrust had already been planted, and it grew with each passing second. The storm outside raged on, an unyielding wall that trapped them together in a crucible of fear. The lights went out again. Another scream, another body. This time it was Sam, crumpled on the floor, his head turned at an unnatural angle. The remaining three stood frozen, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The flickering lights cast their shadows on the blood-stained walls, turning the room into a macabre theater. "We need to stick together," Tara said, her voice trembling. "If we stay in one place, maybe we can—" The lights went out before she could finish. When they returned, Ryan was gone. Only a smear of blood on the floor marked where he had been. Jake and Tara stared at each other, their eyes wide with terror. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the howling wind. Neither trusted the other, and neither dared to turn away. When the lights went out again, Jake braced himself for the worst. He heard a scream, high, piercing, and short-lived. When the lights returned, he was alone. Tara's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, her face twisted in a mask of agony. Panic overtook him. He smashed a window with a chair, the glass shattering into a spray of jagged shards, though the icy wind bit at his skin as he climbed out, the storm wrapping around him like a shroud. Behind him, the lights in the cabin flickered on and off, casting the interior in alternating scenes of light and dark. Jake ran into the storm, his breaths coming in frantic gasps. The snow swallowed his footprints almost as quickly as he made them, erasing any trace of his escape. The wind screamed in his ears, a relentless cacophony that drowned out all thought. As the cabin disappeared behind him, its lights continued to flicker, a haunting beacon in the storm. And somewhere in the darkness, the unseen force that had stalked them watched, patient and unrelenting, waiting for its next opportunity to strike.